Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to call the House to order. The motion before the House today is that standardized tests increase educational achievement. This is an issue on which educators and students and parents have opinions strong on both sides. Some people feel very strongly that standardized tests are essential. Some people feel equally strongly that standardized tests get in the way of education. We'll be hearing some of the good reasons on either sides. In favor of standardized testing, we'll have Dr. Shehzad Jiva and Ms. Aisha Mirza. Against standardized testing, we'll have Dr. Faisal Mushtaq and Mr. Taimur Bande. Just a little bit more about our speakers today. They're very well qualified to be discussing this issue in front of you. Dr. Shehzad Jiva, who will be opening the House, is the CEO of the Aga Khan University's Examination Board. He has served as the chairman of the Interboard Committee of Chairmen, the IBCC. You may be more familiar with that acronym. He's also a member of the National Steering Committee of the IBCC. He's served on the National Curriculum Council, the Punjab Education Commission, the Sindh Curriculum Council, the Steering Committee Sindh, and the Punjab Curriculum and Textbook Board. In some of these capacities, he also serves on the Technical Committee of PEC to provide strategic guidance for formative assessment. He was appointed on the Board of Trustees of the International Association for Educational Assessment in 2021 and is a founding member of the Recognition Committee for that organization. He completed his PhD in chemistry from the University of Cambridge and was awarded the Toby Jackman Prize for the best PhD thesis at Cambridge. He's done postdoctoral fellowships at the University of York and from McGill. He's authored over 30 publications at national and international levels. On the opposition side, our first speaker will be Chaudhry Faisal Mushtaq, who is the founder and chairman of Roots Millennium Education, as well as a former Minister for Education for Punjab. He's been recognized as one of the 500 most influential Muslims of the world in 2014, 15, and 16 by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center in Jordan. He's the founder and CEO of Change in Education Foundation, a nonprofit community development organization. Faisal Mushtaq also serves as the chair of the Hanban Confucius Classroom, Pakistan, which promotes Chinese language teaching. He's a board member for the World Wildlife Fund, the Fauji Foundation, the Young Presidents Organization, and Cadet College Hassan Abdal, which is also his alma mater. He was awarded the Tamgha-e-Imtiaz in 2013. And the second speaker for the proposition will be Ms. Aisha Mirza, who's a career educator, a feminist, and a former debater. And I will add here also my former student and current colleague. She has worked in various schools in Lahore for over a decade. She specializes in the teaching of sociology and politics, curriculum development, and innovative teaching strategies. She leans heavily towards postmodernist approaches to education and is an advocate for holistic student development and open inquiry. She is a former equestrian and a current conservation photographer. Taimur Bande, who will be the second speaker for the opposition, is an educational visionary and my predecessor as the president of the Debating Society of Pakistan. He's also served as the vice chair of the World Schools Debating Championship. He holds a master's degree in international relations and political theory from the United Kingdom with an MPhil in political science. He's trained and mentored A-level economics students for more than 2 decades and has pioneered IB programs across the PYP, MYP, and DP in Lahore from 2012 to 2018. Taimur Bande is presently an IB consultant, setting up IB schools and programs across Pakistan, and director of Zofar Private Limited, an education consultancy firm. Before we begin the debate, I would like you to please take part in the pre-debate poll. because unless this happens, we will not be able to see whether the speakers have been able to sway you one way or the other. So, do standardized tests increase educational achievement? Please log on to the poll, and the poll is open. There are about 2.5 more minutes for you to enter your current opinion on this matter. So this is about whether you think standardized tests increase educational development or not. While you are doing this, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Madam for her most gracious introduction, and to thank Beacon House for putting this event together, and to recognize UBL as the lead sponsors for this event. I think it's sometimes difficult for educators to acknowledge that events like this are only possible when people step up to fund them. And therefore, it is important to acknowledge those who choose to devote funds to sponsoring this kind of event. Thank you all for joining us. Did someone have something to say? During the debate, each speaker will have 8 minutes for their substantive speeches, and there will be a 1-minute time after each substantive speech where one of the opposing speakers will be asking a question. I would ask the audience not to applaud or interrupt during a speech, but to save your applause for the end, so that it's possible for everyone to hear what the speakers have to say. As our pre-debate poll comes to a close, I would like to now call upon Dr. Shehzad Jiva to open the case for the proposition. Dr. Jiva, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and a very good morning to all of you. The topic of today is standardized tests increase educational achievement. Chairperson, Ms. Aisha, yes, it does. And it has been happening since many, many years in many countries in the world. Globally, millions of children, millions of teachers, hundreds and thousands of schools undergoes standardized testing for different purposes. There is a purpose for qualification. There is a purpose for pass or fail. There is a purpose for diagnostic. There is a purpose for licensing. What they are doing is measuring. And measurement is everywhere. If I come to the chairperson and tell her that, Chairperson, my height is 10 feet. Chairperson will say, Jiva Sahab, you might be 6 feet around, but not 10 feet. I will tell her, I use this measuring tape. And this tape is telling me that I am 10 feet tall. She would raise question and say, either the measuring tape has error, or the way I measured it has error, or both has error. So the information I am giving the chairperson is false because of the error. So a good standardized test should be with less error or zero error to give good information. And in education, you do measurements. You do measurements in the classroom. You have a standard curriculum or a syllabus. And based on those syllabus, you either do daily monitoring of the students, which we call it formative assessment, or we do assessment at a certain point where students have to show their ability through their performance, and based on it, you provide a certain information to the students and the parents. It could be used for high stakes or low stakes, for pass or fail. How you use it is a big question mark. How much you use it is a big question mark. People at times mislead. Educationists are also misleading. They give examples of Finland that they don't have testing. Well, they do. They have an examination board, and when they complete their grade 12th, they all have to appear for high-stakes examinations if they want to enter university. And they do have classroom tests on weekly basis or daily basis. They call it evaluation, not test. They call it a big test after a certain given point in time. In many other countries, a lot of informations are provided to the stakeholders like teachers. How much do they know so that they can improve the system, so they all can achieve a common human denominator. A common human denominator means quality of life, aspiration to achieve quality of life. And that happens through good education and good health. Talking about education and focusing there, if we are able to provide students through standardized testing a gateway to higher learning, then you are enabling them to go for quality of life, where they can change their life, the quality that they are living in currently. They can upgrade themselves. You are then enabling them to be the part of the governance rather than being governed. That common human denominator exists everywhere, in every part of the world. Be it Pakistan, call it urban, rural, or the most remote region, everybody wants that common human denominator. You go to UK, you go to the US, you go to South America, you go to Europe, everyone is trying to achieve, and standardization or standardized testing is one of those key instruments in education that helps providing that feedback to decision makers. It creates equity. It gives equal opportunity. If you have examinations which is administered in certain way or standard way, that means you're giving equal chance, equal opportunity to everyone. But if you don't, that means certain segment of the society is getting advantage over the others. And that segment comes out to be high socioeconomic background students. Then it is a clear social injustice. To achieve social justice, you need to have good standardized testing system. I'll give you one example. I'm not marketing my own examination board, but I want to highlight and give you a story of one student. His name is Rohan Prakash. He comes from a minority community, lived in Hyderabad in Sindh in a one single bedroom apartment with his parents. He had only 5% vision. He went to the government board and they said, go to special school. he came to us. He said, I will do my education and my qualification the same way like any other child does, and we provided all the support. He was a brilliant student. He achieved amazingly well in his examination.
1 minute
he was
remaining.
motivated on what he really wants to do. After his FSC or intermediate, he went to USA to study business on scholarship. And right now, as we speak, unfortunately, Rohan is 100% blind, but he has a job at Morgan Stanley. And Morgan Stanley displayed his picture on New York Times Square, showing the world that what education can do, and this is where standardized testing done in the right way can really make an impact in life and ensure social justice. Thank you so much. I rest my case.
Thank you, Dr. Jiva. Dr. Mushtaq, you have about 30 seconds to ask your question.
You mentioned equity in standardized testing. So can you please explain how do you have equity when you have standardization?
Okay, so if I talk about test design, for example, in test design, if the language, in Pakistan, I'll give you an example. Yes, Urdu is the national language, but it is not the mother tongue. English is not spoken in many, many houses in Pakistan. And if you are testing students using English as a first language, then you give advantage to a certain segment of the society and do not give that opportunity to those children to achieve that common human denominator. That is one example of equity. So you have to ensure that you use English language as a second language or maybe a third language, if that exists, to ensure that everyone gets equal opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Jiva. Congratulations. And thank you for both of your remarks. At this point, it is time for the first opposition speech, which will come from Dr. Faisal Mushtaq.
Thank you very much. And first of all, that the very structure of the parliamentary debate is formal, it's structured, and it's giving me stress. That's why I'm against exams. This whole concept of speaking, the parliamentary debate has also evolved. Populism demands that education today has moved from the triangular approach to what it is called a circular approach. There's no more teacher, student, and the parent. At the heart of teaching and learning, it is the child. So as the stakeholders, we must move our abilities and our attitudes. The systematic education dilemma for standardized testing shall be explained. We are teaching the 21st century children through the 20th century adults by the 19th century curriculum, using the 18th century calendar and a 17th century examination and assessment regime. This whole concept of standardization in teaching and learning, it lacks equity and inclusion. We must separate facts from fiction. When you want to talk about student learning abilities and their cognitive abilities for attainment, you must differentiate teach to test or teach to learn. Teaching stops when you enter the classroom. It is the learning that begins after you enter the classroom. So friends, exams today have been replaced by empathy. Grades must be replaced by grounds, and learning should also be assessed by the students' mobility in terms of progression and multidisciplinary abilities. In the past, we were part of the Industrial Revolution where we talked about people, profit, and the planet. People were working for creating a profit and not helping the planet. Today, ladies and gentlemen, the world, Madam Speaker, has moved from people, profit, and planet to what you call is sustainability, social impact, and society. When you want to build children and learning to create a better tomorrow, when you want to talk about climate change, empathy, and sustainability, you want to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equal opportunity, you must remember you cannot create 20th century factory-modeled, inhumane, non-scientific teaching and learning methods called testing. पर्चे का नहीं होगा अब कौमों में चर्चा, ना कौमों को करना चाहिए इस पे खर्चा. I am thoroughly against the concept of these exams. A, B, C. What has it created in our society? Polarization, stress, anxiety. Here are the reasons that I do not support standardized testing. They are not accurate reflections of the student ability. Day before yesterday was the World Mental Health Day. 34% of Pakistani children suffer from anxiety and stress. Number two, they cause stress. Stress is a reality. Emotional and mental health and well-being should be at the heart of teaching and learning. Gone are the days of structured classroom teaching. It is what is called differentiated teaching. Muh mera taraf teacher Sharif, no more. Muh mera taraf student. Whatever the student demands, and that is how we progress. Number three, teachers teach to test. Number four, that such standardized tests, they negate the impact on students' self-esteem. If the student is not able to perform, it has a profound impact on their self-esteem. They pose barriers to future of opportunities. They are disappropriately, they favor certain students, those who come from privileged backgrounds. A student, the one who is coming from a lower income group or a middle income group, will have a different ability level as compared to students from the privileged ones. Education does not mean one size fit all. As a member of the National Curriculum Council, I've always said, what good is enforced uniformity? What good is enforced uniformity in absence of informed unity? You do not need a single national confusion or a testing regime to create further polarization and disparity. Standardized tests are not comprehensive. Students learn only to pass the test. 1,600 schools in the United States have said no to SAT exam because they feel that it does not provide an equitable opportunity for the students to progress forward, and hence they have introduced a non-SAT regime. Even in Pakistan during the COVID, we saw predicted grades and we saw portfolio and assignment-driven marking regimes by so-called the world's largest examination body, Cambridge. Edexcel has gone a step forward. For them, the best grade is now 987, not A, B, C, kithe gayi C. So Edexcel has moved from 9, 8, and 7 because the global suicide rate associated with ABC went disproportionately high, and it was not fair. So lastly, exams do not show college readiness and soft skills. What good is that you prepare a student for a certain grade or a percentile, but you do not focus on knowledge, skills, and values? Today, the achievers and the success stories and the movers and the shakers and the game changers are the students, those who have skills. How do you generate and create these skills? Through transdisciplinary teaching and learning, through collaboration, through critical thinking, through communication. In our classrooms, on one side, we have this 21st century education framework. It is for you, Madam Speaker, to hear this. The 21st century framework is saying critical thinking, communication, cognitive abilities, 21st century skills, digital inclusion. And on the second thing that you do is to prepare students for the first term, and then the midterm, and then the end term. There is nothing such as end term and midterm. It is all about differentiation and having empathy in education, not exams in education. And I would also like to say that the whole concept of education should now be beyond testing. It should be about progression. Post-COVID,
1 minute remaining.
Post-COVID, we have felt a lot of learning losses, and there has been a lot of learning poverty. Your classrooms are not the same. When the earthquake happened in Muzaffarabad, teaching and learning suffered losses for 3 years. Those were 18 weeks of closures. During the COVID, we were closed for 36 weeks. Your students are 3 years behind. So you cannot achieve attainment, achievement, excellence, opportunity, success, diversity, equity, inclusion, as long as exam regimes like global exam boards and other progressive exam boards like yours, Dr. Jiva, as long as you do not evolve, and we should not burden our children, because education is all about love, joy, creativity, and it is about the heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaudhry Mushtaq. I would now call upon Ms. Aisha Mirza to ask a question. And please limit your question to 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sir, if you would please explain that you want to shift it to skills versus knowledge, which I believe is admirable. How will you assess whether the student has learned the skill?
It's a good question. Through a political organization called PAT, Pakistan Awami Tehreek, project-based teaching and learning, assessment-based teaching and learning, activity-based teaching and learning, and technology-enabled teaching and learning. So project, activity, and technology, they are the common denominators to determine the student's skills in today's classroom.
Thank you both. I'd now call upon Ms. Aisha Mirza to continue the case for the proposition, arguing that standardized testing increases educational achievement.
Thank you, Chair, and thank all of you. Thank Beacon House for having me here. It's been a while, bear with me. So just a disclaimer, since this is not a technically competitive debate, I personally, in my opinion, stand rather strongly against standardized testing. However, I also stand on the principle that given today's socio-political environment, it is extremely important for us to hear out with full empathy the other side of the debate as well, which is why I am very grateful to have the opportunity to argue in favor today of something that I may otherwise stand against. Now, as to the case that was given to us by the opposition, addressing that very quickly, it sounds lovely to hear, but most of the critique that the opposition had to offer is a critique of teaching, not of standardized examination. So whatever classroom practices occur, which is teaching towards the test or high test anxiety, or building up anxiety towards high stakes examination, all of that are perfectly legitimate criticisms, but those are criticisms of teaching practices. And they are not the only criticisms of teaching practices, nor are standardized tests the only root of the criticisms of legitimate criticisms of teaching practices which need to be made. So there are a lot of problems in teaching that need to be fixed, and there's a lot in the curriculum which can and should be improved and developed incrementally over time as learners' needs change, as industrial needs change, and as global competence needs change. Change all of that, and by all means build better sensitivity into standardized examination. But when you say that standardized examination are the root cause of all problem, my first question to you is, where is the data? Where's the data to back that up? Because most of these critiques do come from critical theorists and are based in, they take off primarily from the work of Bowles and Gentis and others of their ilk, who interestingly offered very good criticisms, but never really conducted any research in schools. So if we are going to, you're going to ask us to make these major changes which are going to have real world impacts, not just on kids of the privileged, not just on privileged students, but on children who already do not have access to education. I want the nuts and bolts. I want to hear, how is this practically going to be possible? Are you going to make all of this idealism actually work in a classroom and work for the benefit of, not only of the student, but also of the teacher? They're the two main stakeholders of who is present in the classroom and where the transfer of learning is going to happen. So it may sound lovely to hear that there should be greater empathy, which it absolutely should be, and that there should be less stress, which it absolutely should be, but there is nothing predicating that that is necessarily linked to standardized testing. Those are bad teaching practices, and they can always be meted out. Now, as to why we, thank you very much. Now, as to why we do need standardized testing in the classroom and why we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's look at it on two levels. Firstly, let's look at it from the perspective of the teacher. Number one, teachers need concrete evidences of learning to understand what they are communicating in a classroom, whether or not the students overall are learning that, and whether learning outcomes are being achieved. And at this point, it is important to bear in mind that as we speak, nearly 28 million students within Pakistan are out of school. Of the 50 million who are enrolled, 28 million are in public schools and 22 million in private schools, only a very, very infinitesimal fraction of which, less than 4%, are the high fee paying private schools. Most of these kids are coming from lower income backgrounds, and they're in lower fee paying private schools where the teachers already seriously lack the preparedness to teach. So they need effective assessment tools which are constructed for them to assist them in the process of teaching and assessing student outcomes of learning. Now, at the same time, when we were talking about, when Dr. Jiva was talking about ensuring equity, we believe that standardized testing and curricula, where they need work and where they need adjustment and where greater sensitivity can be built into them, are very necessary to help teachers adjust, engage student learning and allow the student to develop, and which is where I want to shift the focus back on the student. Now, as a teacher, I'm always very concerned as to how my students are learning and what their learner type is and how can I reach them better. Interestingly, most studies on cognitive development and metacognitive development do tell us that where a learner has accountability, they learn better. Unaccountable learning can engage greater student time in repetitive learning but has less retention of concepts and knowledge than learning which is made accountable via testing. At the same time, a student also needs to have big ideas framed for them in very clear manner so that they know what are we learning, where am I, what do I need to work on, and where do I need to get to. So basically, the goals and aims and purposes of education need to be very clearly outlined for these kids. What's important to understand here is that standardized testing, of which all of us are the product. Every single person in this room right now, sitting where you are, with all the creative ideas that you have, every single one of you is a product of standardized learning. And if standardized learning killed creativity, none of you would be able to ever bake a cake. So, standardized testing, what it's doing for us is helping us establish...
1 minute remaining.
Thank you. Standardized testing, what it's doing for us is helping establish a baseline of competence in terms of learning, which every single student should ideally have access to. What we need to do is have these clear frameworks, work on the tests that we already have, so that students as well as teachers are empowered in the classroom in terms of having effective feedback to plan their own learning and be able to get to those basic competences which will liberate the individual student to develop their further learning on their own as they will. And nothing is stopping them from doing that. It is enabling. It is not putting a cap on any possible learning. Another important thing that I want to point out here is, right before I end, sorry I'm pushing the time, but 44. That is the average student to teacher ratio that we're currently working with in
Time.
Pakistan. So skills assessment, teachers developing their own assessment tools for 44 students in one classroom. Please show me how the social equity will work there. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Aisha. I'd now ask Mr. Taimur Bande to ask Ms. Mirza a question. Please limit your comment to 30 seconds.
Aisha, thank you for your speech. I just want to point out, you mentioned that the focus of my first speaker was on classroom practices rather than the assessment itself. But don't you think classroom assessments drive the assessment? The classroom practices would drive assessment?
Thank you for that question. They do, but they do not have to. So if we teach teachers to teach better, the problem is solved.
Thank you, Ms. Mirza. I'd now call upon Mr. Taimur Bande to make the final substantive speech for the opposition.
Before I begin, I wanted to actually request the organizers to put up, instead of the time, they could put up the score for Pakistan versus Bangladesh. That would have been more motivational for us. But Pakistan is winning, I hear, so. I think it's very important to pause a little and just step back a little. I think we need to go back and focus on two very key essential words used for the debate today. Now, education achievement is what we're looking at, and we're obviously looking whether standardized testing does that job or not. But education achievement, what do we mean by education achievement? What is an achievement for you as an educator? What kind of achievement measures are we looking at? What do we call achievement or failure for that matter? Those are very, very important questions we need to take stock of and perhaps step back and reanalyze. The first speaker gave very interesting terminologies, and I would like to pick up from there. He talked about purpose and measurement. Purpose, well, that's in line with what I'm asking here in terms of what are you trying to achieve. And this is where I want to go on and say, is your achievement passing a test? Is your achievement making it into a good university only? Is your achievement getting the marks or the grade A plus an achievement? If that is an achievement, then I'm sorry, I really like to disagree. And I feel that this is not the kind of testing that we should be going for. Every child is different. Every child's potential is different. Every child's mindset, skill sets, knowledge, thinking, etc., very different. How can we club them all under one platform? That is not equity. I'm sorry, as the former Prime Minister is asking, that is not level playing field. And that is exactly what we need to give to our students. What is happening right now is that you have a test format for which you have tuitions, for which you have books and resources published, for which you are trying to crack the code for. So what is the target? The target is passing that. Where is the education here? Where is the achievement? And where is knowledge over here? Once you going through that stress of that test, as my first speaker clearly pointed out, that stress bogs you down. It is not just the suicide rates I'm referring to, it is the mental health issues that have cropped up into students. Because what are they doing day in, day out, apart from getting tuitions? They are rote learning. They are basically focusing on how to crack the code. So they're going through those manuals to clear those tests. That is what they're trying to do. So is that the level of achievement we want our students to go through? I certainly do not, and I'll tell you why. We are in 2022 right now. This is where I'll pick up what Faisal Saab was talking about, evolution. We are preparing a generation now, and I'm talking about across the world, for something they should be ready for in 2042. Approximately 18 to 20 years, they'll hit the world out there. Go back 20 years, in 2002, the world was very different. Do we prepare the generation for 2042 based on the skills that we used and we accomplished in 2022? No. The world is evolving. Technology is evolving. Knowledge base is evolving. Thinking patterns, lifestyles are evolving. How can we train the future generation with something that we had trained ourselves with or our parents with? We need new technologies and new approaches. And standardized testing, I'm sorry, does not fulfill that requirement. We have a system around the world, and I'm talking purely on global terms, which talks about modified learning, which focuses on the individual's strengths as well as weaknesses. Because we are now talking about a system which has to be inclusive. How do you deal with a child who has ADHD? How do you deal with a child who's on a spectrum as far as their own sort of working is concerned? How do you deal with autism, with et cetera, et cetera? Don't you want these children to be included in the system? Because I don't see the current system taking care of these very, very talented, gifted children. So we need a system in place that works on the skills of these children. You cannot expect an elephant to climb a tree. You cannot expect a bird to go underwater and swim. So how can we expect children of varied backgrounds and skills to go under one format, under one testing form? We cannot. And therefore, we have to do away with the system. We have systems around the world right now that are working as far as the child's demands are concerned, as their assessments are modified, their rubrics are modified, the curriculum is modified because it is child-centric. The agency drives the entire school. The agency drives the entire curriculum. And therefore, I ask the question, classroom practices will definitely have an impact on the assessments. So therefore, you cannot separate and divorce the two concepts. They are intertwined whether we like it or not. Very interestingly, we were talking about assessment of skills, as Ms. Aisha pointed out. Well, assessment is not unidimensional. It is not just about written examination that you assess a child. A child can be assessed in various forms. A child can be assessed through presentations, through exhibition, through oral viva, et cetera, et cetera. So depending on the skill set, depending on the background of the child, there are multi-dimensional approaches to assess a child. Why do we have to put them under 1 hour of exam where there's yes or no and they're constantly writing it under pressure? If they miss the timing, they will fail, et cetera, et cetera. If they have a fever or there's a death in the family a night before, they're gone. Why can't we assess the child throughout? So there are mechanisms in place, and as far as the success rate is concerned, the system that I talked about, systems like International Baccalaureate, for example, the success rate is much higher in universities compared to the IGCSEs. The acceptance rates are much higher because what are these children bringing to the table? They're bringing more skills to the table than the Cambridge students are. So therefore, the acceptance rates are much higher. So there we have the data as far as that is concerned. So globally on that platform, we need to think from a futuristic point of view. And when you think from a futuristic point of view, you have to do away with these possibilities. Another very important point I need to make over here, because equity was something that was constantly being repeated over here. If I'm privileged, for example, I will go to the best of tutors. I will buy the best of resources, online or physical. My parents would be able to send me anywhere in the world to make sure that I crack the code and I really skim through that particular test. But if I'm not from a privileged background, I don't have access to all of these. So therefore, where does the equity lie in this case?
1 minute remaining.
So based on these lines, we have to think from a very, very practical view. And again, keeping in mind that the child is the focus over here. End of the day, it's that purpose that we need to redefine. And going back to my first sentence, what kind of achievement is an achievement for us? For me, an achievement is what he referred to in terms of a blind child going through an entire system. A child who has a spectrum on autism skims through and reaches university and reaches a good workplace. A child who's ADHD, who was thrown out of the regular stream because the Cambridge could only give him an extra half an hour, becomes successful in a system where he or she is working out there in the real world. That is the level of achievement that we talk about. We talk about the level of achievement where even a child who could not afford the best of tutors in the world is able to skim through a test because it is not standardized, because he or she was able to go through it through whatever means they had in their homes. That is the kind of equity we are referring to, where these kind of discriminations do not occur. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bande. I'd now ask Dr. Jiva to present a question for Mr. Bande.
Thank you very much. On a lighter note, the question, not of cricket. Suppose I mentioned about standardized testing. Its purpose is also for licensing. You are on a plane, and the pilot says, I don't have a license. I failed my tests. Will you sit on the plane, yes or no?
I think you will not allow a pilot without a certificate in the first place, but a pilot's assessment levels, again, can be varied. It doesn't have to be a standardized assessment.
Thank you, Mr. Bande. This brings the substantive speeches to a close. We have a 4-minute summary speech from the opposition, and then finally a 4-minute summary speech from the proposition. The teams are at liberty to decide which of the speakers will deliver those speeches. So I would invite the opposition summary speaker to step up. And the time for this is 4 minutes rather than 8.
4 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Summary speech. Summary is also linked with summative and formative assessment. So the day all of us, since I've been associated with teaching and learning for the last 17 years, all the time we've been talking about summative and formative, farz and sunnat. The day we evolve of a different regime where we are able to judge the skills, the aptitude, and the attributes through the strands that we built in terms of our teaching and learning provision, how we set up the syllabus and the curriculum documents. Curriculum is a different document and syllabus is something else. As a society, we are doing hurriculum with the curriculum and it's causing national variculum. We are rushing, and that rush is creating the sense of fear amongst the test practitioners, not practitioners, test practitioners. Mainly, I brand all the O and the A level and the GCSE teachers, all of them, those who have the wazifa to create an A and an A star. So we need to move out of that pressure, the peer pressure, and to be able to see that how comparison kills creativity. The diversity, it is the difference in the classroom. The diversity, it is itself is the ability of students coming from different ability and knowledge backgrounds and to be able to come together. As an education theorist, I would argue a real good standardized or an education system should not be able to hold the classroom together. All our lives we are taught to hold the classroom together. We should not hold the class together, we should pull the children together towards a common goal, and that is attainment and achievement. Clearly, there are benchmarks in the world. You cannot proceed unless and until the very universities, those who talk about MOOCs, online assessments, they improve on their double standards. All the universities, including Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, MITs, and even national universities like LUMS and IBAs and Aga Khans, they have a very rigid testing regime and an ecosystem. We need to cut down on the level of stress. We need to cut down on the level of anxiety, the comparison. How do we do that? We do it in a stepped and in a phased approach where, first of all, we need to evolve our educational philosophy. What you call is the pedagogical construct. The pedagogical construct of teaching and learning is based around teaching, learning, assessment, curriculum, and holistically education as a whole. The moment we create top-down approach where we look at it, how do we want students to proceed? But I tell you, this word test shall be considered as a negative word in 2030. People, those who will use it, shall be shamed in society, because it's just like many other words when you talk about equity and equal opportunity. Testing is like making a comparison. When, as young women in our society, you don't like comparison as feminists, so the students, they will also not like comparison within their differentiated and differently able skills, abilities, and attitudes. Thank you.
I now call upon the proposition summary speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am definitely a less nice person than I thought I was because I'm enjoying this far too much. Now, in that final summary speech from the opposition, we heard the phrase, a phased approach. Unfortunately, their phased approach advantages the most privileged economic bracket in society first. So my question remains, what happens to my 28 million children out of school? What happens to my student-teacher ratio of 44? What happens to my underpaid and overworked, overstressed teachers? Where do they have the skills, the training, and the time, and the preparedness to teach when they have to now design their own assessments as well? Now, taking on from that phased approach is also this thing about formative and summative assessments. Now, phased approach, there's another term we use in education, it's called scaffolding, right? We're all familiar with it. How does scaffolding work? We teach a kid, we assess a kid. We figure out whether the kid knows what we taught it, whether we need to teach it again, or is the kid ready to move forward? Guess what? How does it happen? Standardized testing. We began our speech with Dr. Jiva acknowledging that not all standardized tests are perfect, just as all classroom teaching practices are imperfect. Both need work, both need development, just as curricula need development. Everything needs greater sensitivity, but we have been running this, we have been practicing this. And guess what? When we get the feedback, we have been fixing it. So all of the programs which are being currently developed are programs which are based on prior learning. And guess what we were using there? We were using measuring tools like standardized testing, which showed us where we were going wrong and where we needed to fix the situation. So this is working on a planning level, on a global level, a regional level, a local level, on a school level, across schools, within a classroom, and for the student themselves. The student themselves has the capacity to gauge and plan their own learning when we give them a clear and effective framework to assess whether they have learned or they haven't learned. They need that. This is the process of mentoring and developing young individuals. Now, as to this thing about skills versus knowledge, and I'm all for it. Knowledge, yes, indeed, is in many ways becoming obsolete, but that obsolescence of knowledge has opened up a new Pandora's box, which we are in today, which is called the post-truth age, where if we are dependent on truths that are no longer verified, or of which we do not care about the verification, it leads to the kind of socio-political chaos that we are experiencing today. So establishing certain
1 minute
truths as
remaining.
truths is actually extremely important, and certain kinds of knowledge communicated in the classroom is absolutely essential for the student to both learn as well as retain over time. Now, even if you want to change it, and definitely a skills component going forward into the future, which is how to maneuver your environment, how to come up with collaborative, creative solutions. And yes, I am all for it. But even if you are going to be mentoring a student to develop a skill, how will you assess it? You will end up assessing, having some sort of a testing or measuring mechanisms to assess it. If that mechanism is not standardized for all students across the scale, even if it allows them the sort of room for creativity that all essay writing subjects do allow, where the students can give open-ended responses and their answers are
Time,
judged
ma'am.
qualitatively. If you do not have that, how do you know that the student has learned? If it's not the same, you do not have social equity, and only the privileged succeed. Thank you.
This is where the audience takes over again. We now have our after-debate poll. you log on again to polls.sotevents.com. We want to know what your opinion is on the question of whether standardized tests increase educational achievement. It may have changed from your pre-debate poll. It may not have. That's fine either way. And same as before, there's still about 2.5 minutes for you to do this. The time for the poll is over. I would request your attention once more. The results of the poll are going to be put up in a moment. In the pre-poll, the audience believed 63% of the audience, 64 almost, that standardized tests increase educational achievement, while 36% believed that they do not. So this was before the debate. After the debate, 49% of the audience believes that standardized tests increase educational achievement, while 51% believes that it does not. So the opposition team is to be congratulated.
So I'll be losing my job.
I now have the good fortune of being able to use my role as moderator to say a few words on the topic myself, now that the debate is over. And the advantage of the moderator role is that I don't have to take a side. I can actually talk about the issue as someone who is a concerned citizen, a concerned parent, a concerned educator. Just someone who thinks about these issues. Where do we want society to be? And what is the best route to get to where we want to be? Is standardized testing going to help us do that or not? Now, one of the things that we didn't really talk about in the debate today is that resources are finite, always. This is something that human beings have been rebelling against in our souls forever. But it doesn't change the fact of finite resources. And when resources are finite, we have to decide, how are we going to get our kids where we want them to be in 20 years? Is it possible for us today to predict what they'll need 20 years from now? Unlikely. So what are the tools that we have to give them so that they'll be able to meet whatever the future throws at them? That's the question we have to answer. Our current standardized tests, are they the way to do it? That seems unlikely. And actually, if you listened carefully to the speeches, I think all 4 speakers agree that not all standardized tests that exist today are going to help us achieve the educational goals that we have for ourselves and for our students. But the fact is that if you're not willing to get on a plane where the pilot isn't licensed, then there has to be some kind of standardized assessment of that pilot before he or she gets on the plane. And so I think the question that we didn't talk about enough is the question test. The word test. What does that mean? If I ask someone to jump over a 1-meter bar, that's a kind of test. It's not the traditional test as you and I and anyone who's a school teacher generally looks at, but I can give a grade to a student based on whether they're able to jump over a 1-meter bar, or a 2-meter high bar, or a 3-meter high bar. And that's a task. It's not a paper test. So there are many ways to test students, and there are many ways to describe educational attainment. One of the problems that we face, and this is not about this debate in this hall, but it's about this debate in the real world, that I think it's hard to argue that activity-based assessment and project-based assessment is not superior. It's generally a superior way to do it. However, in order to be able to do activity-based assessment or project-based assessment, you have to reduce the teacher-student ratio. You have to have very highly prepared teachers, and you have to have very well-resourced schools. And we are currently in a situation where, I mean, let's talk about this honestly. IB kitne log afford kar sakte hain? Right? How many people can afford a school that offers the IB? Very few. There are a couple of low-fee IB schools, but by and large, it is a system that comes to high-fee paying schools, at least in our country. The same is true for the O-level and A-level exams, by the way. This is not that I'm saying that it's just the IB. Any international exam, it's an expensive thing. So we have to think about this carefully, that when we promote these, are we willing to put the resources in? I thank you very much for all your time, and I would urge you to consider these questions when you have a chance to make an input on any educational decision, whether that's in your personal life or your professional life. Thank you very much. Thank you to Beacon House. And thank you to our speakers.